You guys are definitely going to want to see this. The biggest counter to the Ishizu cards right here: Gladiator, Beast, Laquari, Substitute, Miracle Fusion. Essentially, the best counter is to play Edison format. Alright guys, it's the end of an era. The Yu-Gi-Oh! We know and love is definitely changing because this week, Mavens releases, unleashing the Ishizu cards out into the wild that we can play with. And yeah, definitely, I mean, I guess since Power of the Elements format, Yu-Gi-Oh! Has definitely taken a shift, a new level of power creep, you could say. Power of the Elements was strong in its own right. Darkwing Blast definitely affected the format again. And then Mavens releasing these Ishizu cards is going to take the format to a direction where a lot of people are definitely underprepared for just how powerful these cards are. Even though we have known about them for a long time, these cards really do just shape the format around them in so many different ways. They're obscenely powerful. So I am going to just talk about them, what they do, in case you're unaware. Very briefly, I'll say what they do because we should all kind of know what they do by now. And then I'm going to talk about ways to beat them, sort of deck building ideas, and sort of like the best counters, if there are any, to these cards, which, I mean, there are only a select amount, but there are a few in the game, so we can definitely talk about the best ones. So before I get into this discussion, I do want to let you guys know, Discord link down below along with all of our other social media links. Also, I'm trying to climb the 10K ladder, so if you do enjoy this type of Yu-Gi-Oh! Content and you like what you see here, feel free to thumbs up and subscribe. It really helps me out and what I do here on the channel. And yeah, let's get talking about these Ishizu cards. So I'm going to briefly go over what they do because, again, we should know most of these. I'm going to talk about them all at once and then talk about them in pairs. So we have Keldo, and we have Mudora, and then we have Agito, and we have Kelbeck. So these two are essentially like the same type of card, and then these two are essentially the same type of card. So what makes them pairs is essentially their second effect. So Keldo and Mudora, these two, their second effect is in the graveyard, quick effect, or actually while they're on field or in graveyard, quick effect, you can banish 5, or you can target 5 cards in either graveyard, shuffle them into the deck, and then if Exchange of the Spirit is not in the graveyard, which most of the time it won't be, you can only do 3. So essentially they shuffle back 3 cards from either graveyard back to the deck. And then these are paired because their second effect is if they are sent from the hand or deck to the graveyard, you can send the top 5 cards of each player's deck to the graveyard. And that's why Agito and Kelbeck are pairs and Keldo and Mudora are pairs. So their first effects is these two can discard one other fairy monster to special summon themselves, and then they get an additional effect. Keldo can add Exchange of the Spirit or one card that mentions it, which is any of these. Mudora can place Gravekeeper's Trap in your spell and trap card zone, which we'll talk about that in a bit as well. And then these, they have additional effects based if an opponent's card is sent from their deck, I believe. Wait, no, if it's sent from hand or deck to the opponent's graveyard, like Agito will special summon himself, and then you can special summon a level 4 Earth Fairy monster from your graveyard. And then Kelbeck is essentially a hand trap, where if your opponent has a card sent from their hand or deck to graveyard, you can target one special summon monster they control and return it to the hand, and then you special Kelbeck. So yeah, let's talk about the nitty gritty of these cards. Or you know what, let's talk about Gravekeeper's Trap very briefly. While Exchange of the Spirit is in your graveyard, your opponent cannot activate cards or effects in the graveyard or special summon monsters from the graveyard. So it's like kind of an Abyss Dweller, for lack of a better comparison. It's like a mini Necro Valley almost. And then during the main phase, you can discard one card, add one Gravekeeper monster or one Earth Fairy monster from your deck to your hand. So it can search any of these, but this card can also be used for other Earth Fairy strategies, like Madolche is a big one. And then its other effect is, during the draw phase, before your opponent draws, you can declare the top card of their deck. If it's the name you call, it goes to graveyard. If not, it just gets drawn like normal. This is not always super relevant, but in theory it can be, and it gives you deck knowledge. You see what your opponent draws, so that's really nice. Now, let's talk about, honestly, what makes these cards so disgusting. So obviously the big elephant in the room is Tearlament. These cards in Tearlament are disgusting because we obviously have cards that mill 5 for free and cards that want to be in the graveyard in the form of Keldo and Mudora. Now, my biggest problem with these cards is the fact that they are so, like, what's the word? Centralizing, I want to say, because honestly, one of their best counters is themselves. Like, when you look at Mudora and Keldo specifically, they are a good counter to Tear Elements the same way they help Tear Elements, which I find to be really annoying because essentially you want these in your decks. Like, so if you think of decks like Madolche or even Naturia, which is a big one that's new, they can run these cards, and one of their best tier limit counters is to just smash 3 Keldo and 3 Mudora in their deck, and then they'll have like essentially DD Crows in their graveyard. And that's really not good. I don't like when the counter to certain cards are themselves. Like if you think about a game like League of Legends or Overwatch, I'm more focused on that one. Any competitive like game, when there's a certain thing that is so powerful, the only way to beat it is itself, that's when you know you're in a very unhealthy like format. And I really don't like that these counter tier as well as beat or are good in tier. I don't like that idea because it's when you get to the point where it's just too much power for one, you know, centralizing point of the metagame. And honestly, these, what I feel like these should have been is this effect should have been 3 and this effect should have been 1. These cards still would have been insane by all means. These cards still would have been great cards. But it's so ridiculous that like you're never going to need to shuffle 5 cards. Like 3 is all you'll ever need. Oftentimes it's more than what you need, and that's the downside, is that you only get to target 3. I really feel like this should have said 3, this should have said 1. Then these cards wouldn't be so toxic that I feel like they need to be out of the game forever. Like honestly, someday in the future these cards, they might just need to be banned. I don't know. Like they're always going to be somewhat disgusting, and I feel like this was just too much. This should have said one card if you don't have Exchange of Spirit, and this should have said 3. But maybe even the bigger elephant in the room for a lot of people, this Keldo and Mudora personally are my biggest gripes with this whole Ishizu package. Like I feel like these are the most disgusting part for sure. I absolutely despise the fact that they shuffle things back, and I'll sort of explain why when I get to the counters and the deck building side of things. So Agido and Kelbeck, their biggest draw is obviously the mill 5, because in tier limits that's really good. These can also be used in other decks that want to mill 5, and that's really nice for like Naturia and any deck that's like a mill deck. These will have future use past this current format for sure, as long as, you know, they're still alive and kicking. Kelbeck being in a hand trap, I also find to be really gross. I do not like engine hand traps. Like Havnus was one thing, and it was like one deck that had an engine hand trap, and then there's a couple more you could consider. Like of course there's Guru that has an engine hand trap, or Subterror I should say. Noble Knights have one, but when you start making more and more, it becomes more of an apparent problem, and Kelbeck being a hand trap is really gross because you want to play him anyways, and then he's a go second card. I just don't like it. But enough griping about these. What are sort of the ways to counter them? So when you're looking at cards like these that mill 5, which I guess I should also mention how these sort of counter themselves. These also technically counter themselves, which I know I wanted to branch off into counters, but I still want to talk about these cards. Like, because you're not always wanting to mill with these, because you might be playing against tier limits or another deck that's running these, and then these you almost need to use sparingly in some matchups based on like what you're playing against. It doesn't feel like you have to do that often, but it is something to note. Now, talking about counters. So one thing these cards being in the format sort of promote is running cards that are good in the graveyard. Things that are good when they hit grave, good when milled. So obviously tier limit are like a good option here, because if they're milling your tier limits, it's great. Things like, I mean, on the low scale, like Burning Abyss, Naturia, cards where if your cards are getting milled, you're happy. Those are sort of what's promoted in deck building and what could counter this engine, because your opponent is milling your deck for you. Now, what I hate, again, when I come back to these, what I hate about that is you can't really run cards that are good when they hit grave or in grave. Thinking about, like, if you wanted to play Dragon Maid and you wanted, like, if they mill your Tidying in your Parlor or your Chamber, that's, like, really good, so you're pretty happy with that. But because Mudora and Keldo exist, you don't get any benefits. They're just going to shuffle all your stuff back. So it creates almost like, I don't want to say a paradox, but a really interesting point of deck building where you want stuff good that's milled in grave. Otherwise, they're just milling your cards for free. You get no benefits. But if you're running something where your cards are good in grave, they're able to shuffle them back. And that's why I really hate Keldo and Mudora the most. I feel like they're so just toxic because they beat their counters, and I really dislike that. That being said, there are some cards that sort of get around it because these shuffle back sort of things that are going to be problems later, or things that will, you know, they need to be targeted. Something like a branded monster, and then they activate, you know, branded in red, and then these are really good against that. But things like Absolute King Backjack, for example, are going to get their value regardless of these cards existing. So there's some cards like the Naturia Sacred Tree that when they activate, when they hit the grave, those are like pretty good. So playing a deck that has those, I think, is like a good start. So things like Tearlaments, Labyrinth, even if you want to play Backjack in that deck, things that want to hit the graveyard, so like Naturia as well. These, when you see these play against like Sprite in particular, like I've been watching a lot of Sprite versus Tier games post Mavens, and like they're just activating these for free, and unless Sprite mills exactly Angler, they get nothing out of it, and even milling Angler isn't good. And it just puts Tier so far ahead. So that's one thing in deck building I wanted to talk about, was sort of like playing a deck that counters these naturally, which means either running these yourself, unfortunately, or playing a deck with cards that gain benefits from these cards. Now, talking about more specific counters to these, we have things like, I mean, I think one of the best is Abyss Dweller. Abyss Dweller is an insane card versus Tearlament, so when Tier is playing this, any deck that can spam rank 4s going first and make Dweller is quite nice. You have things that, versus these specifically, it's interesting because you're never really going to counter these. You're countering the decks they're in, which namely for this video is Tearlaments. Another one to note, it would be like Earth Shattering Event. Did I spell that wrong? Earth Shattering. Am I dumb? Okay, here we go. Earth Shattering Event. I mean, this card is more of a hard counter. It's kind of a meme, but I figure we should talk about it because if this deck's going to be just absolutely dominant in the meta, it might be worth siding this card. Because it is pretty gross. You can stop them pretty hard with this card. Now, is that going to be necessary? I don't know. Obviously, you have the Bestials, which these are generically good versus Tearlaments, so you can run these as sort of counters. You have things like Silent Graveyard. Obviously, you have very hard counters like this. You have Dimension Shifter. These are cards to definitely think about when talking about counters. For Ishizu Tier specifically, and I mean, some of these counter them in general. Like, I guess these are really good versus the Ishizu cards as well, naturally. And maybe Earth Shattering Event. I mean, not really. These don't really get hurt by that. And I think it's so interesting that you have to, like, hard counter the deck that is playing around these cards, because, like, these cards in and of themselves don't do anything. They're more of a supporting engine to make other decks that already exist, namely Tier, way more broken, which again is really disgusting. Honestly, these cards by themselves take Tier from like a really good deck, probably still already the best in the meta, but at least Sprite's a contender, to a point where Sprite look very weak. And essentially, talking about other decks you can play, like what decks in the format should you probably play against these? I think Exosister will still be a solid deck. You know what, speaking of, let me bring up Necro Valley. If your deck can play Necro Valley, that's solid. If you can play like any of these cards, that's great. So I'm thinking like Crystal Beasts even, like Conclave Control. Where is a picture of Sapphire Pegasus? These are good. We have Robina here, gonna represent Fluanderies. These three decks in particular, Crystal Beast is kind of, I mean, I don't want to say it's a meme. Crystal Beast is surprisingly a decent rogue option because it can run D-Shifter, it can run Necro Valley. You know what's funny is I think Weather Painter is also an option in there as well. They can definitely run D-Shifter. Can they run Necro Valley? I'm pretty sure Weather Painter can run Necro Valley. So I'm gonna put this here. Now, if they can't run Necro Valley, just ignore this card. These are some decks that, I mean, these Crystal Beast and Weather Painter are more of a rogue option if you want to play something roguish in this format. Fluanderies and Exosister, I think most people assume are going to be solid. Now, that being said, while I think they're going to be solid, I don't even think they're going to be that great. They're going to be good enough to play, but it really is looking like Ishizu Tier is just what it is. Now, interestingly enough, talking more about the Ishizu stuff still a little bit, I wanted to mention a couple of cards that you should definitely watch out for. Being Herald of Orange Light. So this is a card that Tier elements can now play because these cards exist and they're fairy, and they play this, and it gives them an out to the most powerful cards against their strategy, like D-Shifter, like Bestial, which is another reason I hate these cards. Like, I hate that not only do they counter themselves, they provide you a counter to their counters, which is something I've been harping on this entire video, but it really is my least favorite thing about this engine. It feels like it's covered every weakness Tier had while giving them more strengths, and I think that's completely disgusting. Counters the Bestials, counters D-Shifter, you know, it hits these decks pretty hard as well. Even if they're going first now, I mean, Tier have a hand trap that deals with them okay. What was the other card? Oh yeah, and something else you can look out for is there's a Thunder Dragon variant of this deck going around, which I actually think is cool. But I mean, that's not super huge to talk about. It's not like you'd ever be siding for these. You're still siding mostly for Tier Limits. But yeah, I think we covered a lot of counters as far as like specific cards as well as decks. Now, I'm sure there's a bunch that I missed because there are so many ways technically you can counter this deck. But as far as deck building concerned, it's like really, really tough. So, you know what, let me know down below in the comments what other counters you guys have in mind. I mean, just to name a few more, we have Soul Drain, which is interesting. You have Shadow Imprisoning, which is okay. You know, these are just some more options as well. I'm trying to give out as many options to maybe deal with Tier Limit as possible. This all being said, maybe just going for a more balanced game plan is the route. Sort of decks we have now, just with extra, maybe some more side deck cards for Tier. Whatever it may be, I hope this helped you guys. Again, leave in the comments below any other counters, things you're thinking about doing for Ishizu Tier format. Actually, let me show you guys the best counter. I'm going to end this video with the most important counter to the Ishizu cards. Let's just remove all of these from the screen. You guys are definitely going to want to see this. The biggest counter to the Ishizu cards right here, we have, let's do Gladiator, Beast, Laquari. We can show off, you know what, we can show off a Substitoad. Let's show off a Miracle Fusion. So essentially the best counter is to play Edison format.